So I'm going to clap, but it's not for myself. It's for the audio. All right, so good. I noticed that some of you have coffee. That's good. I think this is by design, but all the alcohol is in the back. So if anybody needs that. I noticed when we were introducing ourselves last night, going around the circle, much more so than I expected, there are people who are already investing in real estate. And this is also a group where I think a lot more people than I expected are already FI and maybe have been FI for a while. And there's a couple of people that I knew were involved in real estate, a couple that I was sure. I think I expected maybe more newbies. I want to do a raise of hands. Who here participates in the real estate market? Raise your hand if you participate in the real estate market. All right, cool. So my message, I guess for you guys, I'll say that a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about might seem kind of rudimentary, but I think that my take on real estate might be different than some of you, although I think we as people who are from this FI community are probably more conservative than a typical real estate investor, and that's certainly something I'm going to go into today. But my message is for those that didn't just raise their hands, because I would argue that you should have raised your hand. Everybody participates in the real estate market, and I think it's usually your largest expense. If you're renting a property instead of buying, you're making an expensive financial decision. Whether that's right or wrong depends on a lot of factors, and we may talk about that a little. If you're going to buy instead of rent, there's something that goes along with that. It's a big financial decision. It's probably the biggest part of your income going to that stuff. So everybody participates in the real estate market. If you decide not to invest, I would argue that that's also participating. You're making an important decision with your money. Next slide. Oh, I have to do the slides, yeah. Next slide. Okay. Slide. Probably should have just held the clicker. I'm supposed to do this in 20 minutes. I need to start talking faster. I want to get through this quickly and just kind of get my philosophy out there. I would love to pontificate on every detail because I love talking about this. It's my favorite thing in the world. I want to get through all of this and have us talk for the next 40 minutes about real estate and FI and the implications of that. And then, of course, it's not going to end after 40 minutes. The rest of the time we're here, let's keep talking about it. Come talk to me about it. We can talk about it as a group, whatever. But I'm going to go through the 1% rule, 50% rule, appreciation myth, and buy versus rent debate. That's actually a lot for 16 minutes. Next slide. This is the most important slide to me. I'm going to talk about myself. I better do it fast. I wanted to find the coolest looking pictures of me that I could and put them up here. That's the best that I could do. But I was in the military for 20 years. I was in the Air Force. My job was, I hate that I have to couch my job this way because no one's heard of my job unless I refer to the Navy. Have you guys heard of NCIS? So I was the Air Force version of NCIS. We just don't have a TV show. That might be something that I'm able to do now that I'm FI. So I was a federal agent. First half of my career, I was more in the suit, doing I guess you would call it street agent stuff. Second half of my career, I was more like doing what I'm doing right now, except that I was wearing a uniform and drinking coffee and giving or listening to PowerPoint presentations. But it was an awesome career. Has nothing to do with what I do now. I lived mostly overseas while I was in the military, and that does transition into my experiences with real estate. I mostly invested in real estate from overseas. I bought here in the United States, but I was in Germany, Japan, and Korea when I did most of my real estate investing. So I would say my specialty is long-distance real estate. Next slide. That joke will probably die soon. I want to get through this fast, so here we go. 1% rule. I think it's the most important rule in real estate. It's also one of the most hated rules in real estate. Lots of people love to hate it because it means that they can't invest where they are. The 1% rule simply states that if you, let's say that you buy a property and get it rent ready, and that costs you $100,000, you should be able to rent that property out to somebody for at least 1% per month of that price. So 1% of $100,000 is $1,000. If you can rent that property for $1,000 or more, it might be a good investment. If it's less, and if it's a lot less, it would be a bad idea to buy that rental property. That's kind of the basics of the rule. People love or hate this rule for different reasons. I happen to love it, and we'll get more into that. Let me talk about how I apply this to my life, my investing life. So Montgomery, Alabama happens to be where all my properties are right now. One of the reasons for that is that throughout an Air Force military officer's career, he ends up going to Montgomery, Alabama quite a bit. So I was there a lot. When I was there in 2013, I was going to live there for 10 months. It was basically a school year. And then I didn't know where I was going to move to. So should I buy the house that I'm going to live in, or should I rent it? 1% rule. The house that I wanted to buy was in a semi-gated community. Had like a pool, had like these little ponds you could fish in, like low crime, decent school districts. $180,000 was what it would cost. So if that can't rent for at least $1,800, I don't think it'd be a good idea to buy as a rental property, especially because I know I have to move away. So I rented for they rent for $1,400. So I decided then I'll just rent, because it's not going to make sense. It's not going to make money and I'll get more into why later. It's not going to make money as a rental property. If I buy, I'd rather rent. So I rented, but 5 miles away, I found several neighborhoods where the houses were cheaper, but there's some differences. There's more crime, right? The school districts aren't quite as good. The houses are smaller. It's not a gated community. Doesn't have an HOA. I can buy a house there, and these prices are going to upset some people, but like I could have bought a house there in 2013 for $50,000. It needs to rent for at least $500 a month to make sense as a rental property. But they rented for $800 a month. And I'm like, okay. Now I'd come from DC, right? So this seemed like an amazingly cheap house and also an amazingly high rent to me. So I bought 6 houses there over the next 10 months. And then when I left, I continued to buy from overseas. So that's kind of where my properties came from. But that's also, I bought in one part of town, but I rented the house that I was living in because financially it made more sense because of the 1% rule. I kind of talked about the last bullet already. What affects the 1% rule? Things like, one is like just being in a high cost of living area. If you're in a high cost of living area, Hawaii, DC, coastal cities, you're not going to meet the 1% rule. It does buy and hold rentals, and we're going to talk about Airbnb, right, at some point. I think, are you talking about Airbnb? Yeah. We're going to talk about it, but I'm talking about buy and hold rental and investing, and it doesn't make sense in places like that. Gated communities, good schools, low crime, big house, special house, new construction, all bad for the 1% rule, not good investments. The I'm cash flowing myth. I see this a lot because everybody loves to get together at a barbecue or over drinks and talk about how much money they're making in real estate. I think a lot of people misunderstand their expenses. And I see this a lot for the average investor who, especially in the military, who buys a house in DC, stays 3 years, moves to Texas, and then at a barbecue with their friends says, my house in DC is awesome. I make $200 of cash flow a month. I'm always surprised when I hear that. Wow, $200 from DC, like that's amazing. How does that work? Like, how did you work that out? Well, my rent is $2,000 a month, but my mortgage is only $1,800, so I make $200. This is awesome. Well, we know that doesn't work. Like those numbers don't work, and so I usually get mean and I say, well, what about your expenses? And then I explain the 50% rule. The 50% rule states that if your rent is $2,000 a month, it is likely that about 50%, it's definitely not 10 or 20%, but 50% is a good guideline, a conservative one. 50% of that's going to be expenses. And that does include property management, but that's your expenses. So let's go back to this guy's example. $2,000 a month is what his rent is. Half of that is expenses. Now let's subtract the $1,800 mortgage. So he's negative cash flowing $800 a month. Now that's an extreme example. It does happen. Why is it that bad? It's that bad because when he bought the house, he was probably nowhere near the 1% rule. He probably bought a big house in a nice neighborhood that was new, right, and had no and low crime, best schools. I want to talk about the 6% assumption. If you combine the 1% rule and the 50% rule with each other, what it comes out to mathematically is that the ROI in your property is about 6%. I'll try to like say this in a way where it makes sense, because it barely makes sense to me. But if it's 1% per month, which means 12% per year of rent, right, is what we're saying you want to get. But if half of that 12% is expenses, then the other half of that 12% is your cash flow. So that's where the 6% assumption comes from. You can also do this. Appreciation might be approximately 2 to 3% a year. So you're getting this like 8 or 9%. Why do I bring this up? Because I equate this to what we have widely accepted in this community of index fund investing. You're going to get approximately like 7% if you put your money in the market and just leave it there. And so why I like and preach the 1% rule is why would I bother? Why would I bother messing around with real estate? Because it could be a pain in the ass. Why would I bother unless I can beat what we've already accepted in this community, beat what you can do truly passively? Because I heard some of you saying here you want to start doing real estate passively, right? Real estate is like not passive. It's not passive. There's work. Even when you have a property manager, it is work to manage the property manager, unless you don't mind losing money. Next slide. I wanted to pause longer. The appreciation myth. Some familiar faces up here to some of you maybe? This is the first house I ever owned in my life. I bought it for $280,000 in Washington, D.C. It's a townhouse. I thought it was the worst mistake of my life. Obviously, it got me to like this journey on real estate, so it was not the worst mistake of my life. I thought I was drastically overpaying, $280,000. I thought for sure that it wouldn't go up another penny for the rest of my life. That ended up not being true. 2 years later, this is in 2003, 2 years later, $280,000 property is worth $400,000. And at that point, I realized how good I was at real estate investing. Right? I'm going to keep doing this. Every house for the rest of my life. And I'd done the calculation. I actually did it on a spreadsheet. I was going to have like 10 million within the next like 5 years. Right? I'd proven it to myself. That ended up not happening. But I bought that house in 2008, or in 2003 for $280,000. 2 years later, it's worth $400,000. I sold it in 2016, which I think is 11 years after that. In 2016, what did I sell it for? $280,000, $400,000. In 2016, I sold it for $400,000. So what does that mean? It means that my short-term appreciation was almost 40%. And my long-term appreciation over 13 years was what it should be. Actually, I think it was a little bit less than 3%, so it wasn't great. This is in a high cost of living area. The other point that I want to make is that Doug Norman has owned 3 different houses in Hawaii over the last 30 years, and one of them's been a rental. And I had him calculate his appreciation, because in the military, you always hear the stories about how much money people have made off of appreciation by buying in Hawaii. Over 30 years, average out those 3 properties, between 3 and 4% per year is what he's gotten. He's certainly seen years where it went up 30 or 40% in 2 or 3 years' time, but nobody knows when those years are going to be, when or where they're going to be. And so that is this appreciation myth. If you're chasing appreciation, you're going to hurt yourself. And then the buy versus rent I want to talk about real quick. Again, Doug Norman, I know some of you don't know him. He's a military blogger well known in this community. He had a blog that's done very well, and he's also spent the last 20 years like surfing 3 to 4 times a week. He surfs and he like answers questions on Facebook groups. And like that's his entire life. That is my goal. That's what I want to do. He wrote 2 articles for the military, but I think it's applicable to everybody. And one was, don't buy a home at every duty station you move to. Which I think a lot of real estate investors are like, what? You should buy, and you shouldn't. You shouldn't buy a home at every duty station. The next article he wrote was, don't buy a home when you retire. Now, people are like, what? I've been waiting my whole life to buy a home when I retire. So I want to talk about this for a second. The forever home myth. Of course, there's going to be cases where this makes sense, but I've seen, and Doug shows in this article that he wrote, that quite often, the thing you've been planning for 10, 15, 20, or 30 years, the big event, I'm going to move back to Nashville, and I'm going to buy a farm, and I'm going to stay there. I'm going to be so happy, and I'm going to stay there the rest of my life. Once you get there, once you move there, Nashville, right? Once you move there, like something in your life changes, or something in your spouse's life changes. You bought this big, expensive house, and now you're offered a job in California for triple what you're making now. Now, no, I don't want to be here close to family. I want to be close to my kids, and they're way over here. I want to leave. Now, you or your spouse decides you want a divorce. Like, these are all things that happen. So this idea of I can buy a house as long as I know I'm going to stay somewhere for a long time, take that with a grain of salt. Because it's expensive. It's very expensive to get out of an expensive forever home purchase, especially when you change your mind in a year or two. And it happens way more often than people want to believe. Last thing I'll say about this, and I'm probably over on time, but I did better than I thought I would. The liquid versus illiquid point is obvious, I think. Houses are pretty illiquid. The most you pay versus the least you pay. When you rent a house, the rent is the most you'll pay every month. When you buy a house, the mortgage is the least you'll pay every month. What else are you going to pay? The 50% rule, right? You're going to pay at least 20 to 30% more, but you could pay a lot more. And I want to wrap this up so we can get to talking. So takeaways. My rule for buying real estate, I always like to tell this to people in the military, but it applies, I think, to everybody. I won't buy a house, even a primary residence, unless it passes the 1% rule. Now, it's trickier than that. The 1% rule is where you start. I mean, you have to actually calculate everything out and see if it's going to work. But I won't buy a house unless it's going to cash flow well as a rental if and when I move away. I'll rent. There's something called a quality of life exception. I just bought a house. And this is my office. This is the balcony. It's on a golf course. Like it's an overpriced house. It met the 0.2% rule, right? No, I mean I'm in Montgomery, Alabama. It's a $400,000 house, which some of you are probably thinking like that is absurdly cheap, and it's like in the nicest neighborhood in Montgomery. So it's actually it's a decent deal, but it breaks my own rule. Why? Go ahead and buy the house that you want as long as you understand it's not an awesome investment. It's not going to make you rich. And if something happens in your life that you've got to move away in a year or two, you're going to take a hit. If you recognize all those things, like go ahead and buy it because you're not making a financial decision, you're making a quality of life decision. Cash flow versus appreciation, obvious. The obvious point of a lot of this is, and it's a good lesson to learn right now because I think as the market gets crazier and crazier, we all start lying to ourselves more and more about what we can get away with when we invest in real estate. Buy for cash flow. Whatever cash, you will know the cash flow you're going to get when you buy a house. You can calculate it. It's not like going to be a secret. The appreciation, you will never know. I like to assume that there is zero appreciation. If you end up making a fortune on appreciation, like that's great. Then you get to buy 10 years earlier, whatever. So that is my presentation. And now we're going to move to the rest of the time, whatever that is, being like a Q&A or a talk. So you want me to do this? Oh, no, not necessary. Oh.